Good morning and afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Labor, Employment, and Human Rights webinar, Pass the Vibe Check, All Facts, No Cap on Legal Issues in Managing Intergenerational Workplaces. My name is Rachel Younan, and I'm a partner in Fasken's Labor, Employment, and Human Rights Group and based in our Toronto office. In my practice, I represent both unionized and non-unionized employers, advise on employment standards, employment contracts and terminations, workplace policies, departing employee litigation, human rights and accommodation, grievance arbitrations, labor relations, and collective agreement interpretation. Before I introduce Shakila, please see the administrative information that is outlined on the screen. I'd like to draw your attention to the survey and CPD certificate points. QR codes and links will be available at the end of the event to fill in our survey and to obtain your Ontario, Quebec, or BC CPD credit. We'd appreciate it if you could take a minute to fill out our survey as well. Joining me today is Shakila Salem, an associate based in our Toronto office. She maintains a broad labor and employment practice representing both unionized and non-unionized employers. And with that, we'll now move on to our presentation. So on the slide here, we have a roadmap for what we'll be discussing today. So today we're going to talk about who is Gen Z. We're going to talk about how Gen Z is redefining the workplace. We're going to talk about what you can do as an employer in light of Gen Z's presence in your workplace. We can talk about quiet quitting and legal risks of quiet firing. We'll talk about social media at work, remote and hybrid work as well, and we'll discuss the legal challenges in managing intergenerational conflicts at work. So who is Gen Z? That is the question that we start with today. So Gen Z refers to individuals who are born between the mid-1990s and early 2010s, known often as digital natives due to their upbringing in the internet era. They are chronically online, as studies tell us. In fact, a study by McKinsey showed that Gen Zers spend 6 or more hours per day on their phones. And I bet a number of other generations probably do so as well at this point. Gen Z makes up 20% of North America's population at present. And they are a rapidly growing percentage of the population, poised to become a majority in the workforce. Their digital fluency influences their expectations and interactions in professional settings. So why should we care about Gen Z? Well, as I said, Gen Z is growing and growing fast. Given that they will soon become a majority of the workforce and that they come with their own unique perspective and values that may redefine workplace norms and therefore the workplace. And so it's important to think about the issues that are important to them and the attributes and characteristics that they may have. So thinking at a high level about what they value, what the research tells us, what we understand is that Gen Z are socially progressive. They value racial justice, equity, and diversity. They value a level playing field for professional development and career opportunities, particularly for individuals from underrepresented backgrounds. They are climate conscious. They are advocates for sustainable and green practices. And they recognize that their generation and other generations will be impacted by climate change, perhaps more significantly than older generations. And they value mental health and work-life balance. So let's delve in more detail into what sets Gen Z apart. Let's understand this generation before we decide how to act. And of course, while I won't repeat this throughout our presentation, I do want to note that some of what we're talking about today and these sort of characteristics that we're going to talk about are, of course, broad generalizations and characteristics about a generation writ large. Individuals who are part of the Gen Z generation will necessarily differ in their characteristics at an individual level. Their values will differ and vary, and their motivations similarly will differ and vary. And so we need to always be mindful of the fact that we are talking sort of about broad, sort of sweeping sort of observations about a generation as a whole. And of course, individuals in other generations may also identify with these value points and these characteristics. So let's talk first about what we see with Gen Z and having sort of a values-first mindset. So what does that mean in a workplace context? That means that they really prioritize values over traditional metrics. So they prioritize purpose and meaningful work, not just compensation metrics or their paycheck. So rather, Gen Z tends to look for employers that align with their ideals. Again, thinking about equity, diversity, and inclusion principles, racial justice, mental health, etc. They also generally are not afraid to walk away. And so while older generations tend to remain with the same employer until retirement or for longer stretches of their career, Gen Z are less likely to stay with employers if their needs for flexibility, growth, and alignment aren't met. And so what we see and what the research shows us is that this has led to higher turnover compared to older generations. They tend to have a preference for hybrid work. Since COVID, Gen Z has championed hybrid work schedules and the flexibility it provides for them. Of course, this is also being embraced by other generations as well. And then there are other sort of characteristics that we see are economic pressures. So this generation tends to face economic pressures such as student debt, high housing costs, and stagnant wages. Often, and this is true for some, but not necessarily for all, a lot of Gen Z still live at home with their parents. And so they're looking for employers who understand and recognize these sort of economic pressures and their social realities. So why are these general characteristics of Gen Z sometimes viewed as challenges in the workplace? Well, some of these are obvious. High turnover rates mean that employers experience additional labor costs, while other characteristics here are less obvious. A values-first mindset is not necessarily challenging in a workplace if harnessed properly. Often there is, of course, a perception of lack of engagement and whether that potentially impacts productivity. So the first step to understand is to understand really what motivates and helps engage many Gen Z workers before we move to solutions and strategies. So now that we've thought a bit about what motivates Gen Z, let's talk a little bit more about what we can do, some real sort of on-the-ground ideas here. So to address some of the sort of perceived and real challenges associated with generational differences between the norms we've come to expect from older generations and the motivations of Gen Z workers, employers can focus on creating a supportive work environment that aligns with Gen Z values, that offers career progression opportunities, embraces flexible work arrangements, and fosters open communication. By understanding and adapting to Gen Z's expectations, rather than expecting that Gen Z necessarily just fits right into the current workplace model, organizations can enhance engagement and productivity along generational lines. Let's talk about increasing transparency. So information sharing is a really good first example here, and that is, and some of these ideas, a lot of these ideas are coming from an article that's cited on the slide here from the Harvard Business Review. So increasing transparency in information sharing. So explaining big changes within an organization as those changes occur and the rationale behind those changes. So making sure that employees are not being kept in the dark. And really communicating around what's happening and why things are happening. Of course, as for all employees, economic pressures create anxiety and fears of potential layoffs and terminations, and so transparency can help alleviate those fears. When we think about helping Gen Z in terms of career progression and the value that they place on that, it's important to show paths for career advancement and a variety of different paths if available. That provides Gen Z workers with a sense of security. It helps incentivize hard work, and it may increase motivation. Similarly, it is suggested that Gen Z workers value autonomy, and so providing them with as much autonomy as possible will be helpful to retaining them in your organization and getting the most sort of productivity out of and engagement out of them as possible. So what can we do to help with autonomy? Well, we can avoid micromanaging. This leaves room for individuality and autonomy and helps keep Gen Z staff engaged. We can also think about giving constructive feedback, which helps demonstrate, not only does it help the worker actually improve in their performance, of course, but it helps demonstrate that you as their manager or as their employer are invested in their success as an employer. And of course, with our lawyer hats on, it's important and helpful always to sort of record the constructive feedback and coaching as it's being provided. So that's something that's helpful to have on hand. And then we can think about wellness and mental health goals and approaches. So prioritizing mental health in your workplace is a good sign for Gen Z workers that you care about their overall well-being. And going back to sort of things that motivate Gen Z, characteristics and attributes of Gen Z individuals as a whole, work-life balance is important to Gen Z workers. And so, if we can take steps to prioritize mental health, make that a priority in the workplace, and then advocate for work-life balance, then that's really helpful again to retaining Gen Z workers. Some of the research shows that many Gen Z workers are willing to relocate or change jobs just to achieve work-life balance. And then finally, on this point of wellness and mental health, checking in with your employees. If performance has declined, talk to the employee to understand the underlying reasons and how you can support them. I would say, don't assume that it's because they don't want to be there and they don't want to be a productive member of your team, but rather there may be something else going on that they need some support with. And with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Shakila to talk about quiet quitting and quiet firing.
Thanks so much, Rachel. So quiet quitting and quiet firing are new terms that recently gained popularity in the last few years, usually from social media platforms like TikTok is where I personally first heard of it. And you yourself may have heard these terms before as well. Since they are so new, we haven't seen them trickle into case law just yet, but it will be interesting to see how these terms will shape the employment litigation landscape in the next few years. So first, we'll turn to quiet quitting and look at exactly what it is. So in simple terms, quiet quitting essentially means doing the bare minimum or your primary responsibilities at work and just leaving it at that. So it's essentially saying, I'm hired to do X because it's in my job description, and I won't do Y because it's not in my job description and I'm not getting paid to do Y. employees essentially not going above and beyond or overextending themselves at work because they don't feel the need to. Employees have found it to become somewhat of a badge of honor to quietly quit at work. And this is particularly seen in employees who don't feel motivated at work or feel like they're being exploited at work. It generally reflects there's this broader dissatisfaction with their work culture because they don't feel engaged in the work that they're doing. So they choose to quietly quit and maintain the bare minimum just to remain employed, but don't show that added initiative to go above and beyond. So that's just a general summary of what quiet quitting is. Now we'll look at what you can do as a manager or employer to prevent quiet quitting. So the first thing you would want to do is look at the work culture in your workplace and try to foster a genuine team building mindset with the employees to instill the mindset of our wins are your wins. This helps create a sense of loyalty to the company for employees. It helps them stay engaged and contribute to the success of the company because they feel like they are actually a part of it. And in that same vein, you'd want to reward and recognize initiative where you see it in employees, and avoid holding out employees who promote those initiatives and take that extra step. Avoid holding them in line for promotions. Usually employees who are going above and beyond are doing it because they want to progress in the company. They seek promotions out. And so where you feel like an employee and where it applies and there is an opportunity to give an employee such a promotion, it is a good way to incentivize that they remain loyal to the company and stay engaged. If you're finding that there is a lack of morale, empower employees to provide feedback on what they think could foster a better working culture in the workplace. I'll give them an opportunity to provide that feedback and allow them to feel comfortable in providing that feedback. And once they do provide it, listen to the feedback and try to implement changes where possible. Sometimes employees turn to quiet quitting because they don't enjoy the working environment as a result of unfair treatment or if they're experiencing bullying or harassment at work. Where you find that there is bullying and harassment, aside from your general obligations to address the bullying and harassment, it also helps the employee feel supported that you as their manager are protecting them from any bullying and harassment that they may be experiencing at work. And in addition to that, if you do see employees are feeling discouraged or less invested in their work, try to have a conversation with them about why it is that they feel that way. Sometimes the solution isn't necessarily monetary or compensation wise, but maybe it's looking for a new role for them that aligns more with their interests. And that might not necessarily be a higher role, but even a lateral move to a different position that aligns with what they primarily enjoy doing. Or it's changing their working conditions to the extent that you think that it is feasible. So that is sort of a summary on quiet quitting. Next, we will turn to quiet firing, which is essentially the antithesis of quiet quitting. So quiet firing is essentially a term that describes subtly pushing employees to leave their jobs without actually terminating them. There's primarily two reasons why managers think that this is a good idea. The first being that they want to avoid having the awkward conversation of actually terminating somebody. So they might lean in towards a quiet firing tactic. Or it's to simply just get out of paying severance or pay in lieu of notice for termination. It is not a recommended approach to termination because what ends up happening is there is a fine line between quiet firing and the legal term constructive dismissal. And where a court finds that there is constructive dismissals, it could actually result in more damages should it proceed to litigation. Added damages of punitive or bad faith you could be held liable for either one on top of the actual wrongful dismissal damages. So examples of quiet firing are quite nuanced. They could be as simple as exclusion from meetings. This doesn't mean excluding an employee from one meeting is necessarily quiet firing, but if it's a pattern of exclusion from meetings, micromanaging, where the employee wasn't able to do their job without having somebody looking over their shoulder the whole time, or even keeping them in stagnant positions and not putting them forward for any opportunities for promotions or other opportunities that are being offered to other employees at the company. Again, it is a very fine line, which is why it is not a recommended approach. So if there's a fine line between quiet firing and constructive dismissal. So it is really not a recommended approach for termination. And we can actually see that in this recent 2015 decision from a court in Ontario. This was an employee who was working for his employer for 18 years and went on a leave for a heart surgery. And when he returned to work, he found that his employer had made significant changes to his employment. So he changed his reporting structure, where the plaintiff was formerly reporting to a director of finance, and when he came back, he was reporting to a credit manager. The plaintiff lost his managerial responsibilities, wasn't able to handle a lot of the key responsibilities that he was handling prior to his leave, and his duties shifted to more of a clerical nature that he wasn't doing before his leave. And as a result of these changes, the court actually found that the employer had constructively dismissed the plaintiff, and in fact ordered 12 months pay in lieu of notice of termination. So we can see here how those subtle changes can actually make a lasting impact on an employer's deemed termination. The next case is actually a more interesting one, and the key takeaway from this 2019 Ontario Court of Appeal decision is that changes in the working condition don't necessarily have to tie in with your key responsibilities, but if the employer makes a change in the workplace that makes continued employment intolerable for an employee, it could also lead to constructive dismissal. So in this case, the employer had rehired an executive who was terminated 11 years ago, in part due to sexual harassment allegations. When they rehired this executive, the employer offered the plaintiff, who was the employee who the executive had sexually harassed, a transfer to another building, keeping her in the same position, but just offering her a different location to work out of since this executive was returning to work. The plaintiff declined and filed a claim for constructive dismissal. And the court found in favor of the plaintiff and determined that the decision made by the plaintiff's the decision made by the employer actually made the plaintiff's continued employment with the employer intolerable. So not only was the plaintiff awarded 12 months notice, pay in lieu of notice, but also $100,000 in bad faith damages. And with that, we are going to turn to social media at work.
Perfect. Thanks, Shakila. Okay, so we started talking at the beginning about the fact that Gen Z tends to be high users of digital platforms. So social media is an integral part of Gen Z's daily life, as the research shows us. It influences how Gen Z communicates and expresses and express themselves. And as digital natives, they are accustomed to using social media to share their experiences, to share their opinions, and to engage with communities. Now, in the workplace, this can present both opportunities and challenges. Managing Gen Z's social media use requires a balanced approach that respects their digital fluency while similarly safeguarding company or organizational interests. So how do we do that? So managing Gen Z's use of social media, and frankly, this applies across generations. So just generally managing use of social media in the workplace involves setting clear expectations, encouraging responsible use, and additionally leveraging social media as a tool for positive engagement. By implementing these types of strategies, employers can really harness the benefits of social media while mitigating potential risks. And that ensures a productive and harmonious workplace environment. So what are some key considerations that employers should bear in mind with this generation and the use of social media at work broadly? Well, first and foremost, it has never been more important to develop comprehensive social media policies that clearly outline what acceptable use is in a particular workplace. And again, both within and outside the workplace. As with all policies, those policies shouldn't sit collecting dust on a shelf. They should be regularly updated to reflect new platforms and trends, to address issues that are being seen, and make sure that they're responsive to the concerns and considerations of a particular workplace. Similarly, it's important to communicate those expectations and the policies effectively to all employees. That can be through training, through sort of regular reminders and feedback, emphasizing the importance of adhering to these guidelines to protect both personal and company reputations. So if we think about some of the sort of values that we have talked about Gen Z, about autonomy and transparency, all of these tips that we're talking about in terms of social media use play into those values and the things that Gen Z find important. Okay, being open about why we have these policies, what the impact of social media use is on our organization, and also leaving room for employees to engage in their social media activities as we know they will. Think also about your use of emails and messages. And remind yourselves and your managers that emails and messages can be published online. So things that we write down are potentially out there forever. And so thinking about how we communicate with workers is incredibly important, particularly in an age where what we put in writing by email or over text message can quickly be broadcast to thousands or millions of other social media users. And on that topic, where possible and if possible, avoid virtual meetings for sensitive topics. I'm sure we can all think of a different example of employee recording a meeting that they maybe ought not to be recording. And in this environment that we work in now, we have to be mindful about the potential for that to occur. So, of course, with respect to social media monitoring or surveillance, we need to ensure that we are complying with applicable privacy laws. Now, depending on which jurisdiction an employee is in, this may include being transparent about what is being monitored and why, and there may be restrictions on what you can or cannot monitor as an employer. We should ensure that employees understand that their online activities, even off-duty activities, can affect the workplace if those activities breach conduct guidelines or damage the company's or the organization's reputation. And so, again, thinking about autonomy, flexibility, these kinds of principles and concepts that are important to this generation. While we need to encourage responsible use, we also want to foster a culture where employees feel comfortable seeking guidance if they're not sure about the appropriateness of a social media post. And again, sort of coming back to being transparent and communicating and having open communication so that there can be a discussion with a Gen Z worker or other workers about, what that social media post might be, whether it is or is not appropriate, why, how a post might impact the employer's reputation and the professional environment. And then think about how we can look at social media as a positive tool. And really, the fact that Gen Z is so adept at using social media, this can really be a positive for your organization. So thinking about ways to encourage employees to be creative in their use, to harness the power of social media for the purposes of your business or your organization. I think it's always helpful to look at the flip side here. While there are certainly risks associated with social media use and the prevalence of it with these generations, we don't need to just look at it as a downside or just a risk. So let's talk just for a moment, because I touched on it very briefly about, let's talk about social media and off-duty conduct. So important, of course, to clearly communicate, and this sort of goes back to what we were talking about in the prior slide, about clearly communicating that employees are accountable for their online conduct, even off-duty. So again, if their off-duty conduct impacts the workplace environment or workplace harmony, or creates a toxic environment or otherwise breaches conduct codes, that is going to be a problem. And so we should be making employees aware of that. It's not so easy to just sort of separate the line between personal and work anymore in this digital environment. And so Shakila will talk and she'll talk more about, and she has talked already about workplace harassment and toxic work environments. And she'll talk more about how off-duty conduct can create issues in that respect. And so thinking about making employees aware, training them, setting expectations about online behavior, and outlining the consequences of online behavior that leads to reputational harm or that disrupts team dynamics. And of course, referencing back to your policies where applicable. And so on the slide here, we're talking about, again, the nexus here, or the interaction between social media and off-duty conduct. And so recall that off-duty conduct is a challenging basis for cause to terminate an employee, but it certainly is not impossible that an employee could be terminated for cause due to off-duty conduct in connection with their social media use. So employees are responsible for their online conduct to the extent that that behavior damages or harms the reputation of their employer, leads to other employees refusing to work with them or being reluctant to do so, Of course, if their conduct online amounts to a breach of the criminal code, that they will be held responsible for that, and an employer may have the basis to terminate for cause in those circumstances. And then also circumstances where it makes it difficult for their employer to carry out its functions of effectively managing its workforce. So not always the easiest. We can spend a whole presentation talking about off-duty conduct and termination for cause. Certainly it's not the easiest basis, or it's not necessarily always going to give you a basis for a cause for termination, but it is certainly something to keep an eye on, and something to remind employees of as you are educating them and being transparent with them about social media and how and what the boundaries are with respect to their use of social media. So I'll turn it to Shakila to talk a little bit more about a case on this point.
Thanks so much, Rachel. So yeah, as Rachel just mentioned, employers can be held responsible and can discipline employees for their behavior on social media, which is deemed to be off-duty conduct. So this case from the Ontario Labour Relations Board describes just that. So in this case, there was a group of employees who were harassing their colleague on social media through various platforms. And the employee brought a complaint to the employer and said that she was being harassed by her coworkers online. And the employer conducted an investigation and found that there was, in fact, online evidence of online harassment by a group of these employees after conducting a thorough investigation. And in presenting the investigation results to the employee ultimately did end up filing a complaint with under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And the reason she did that was because the results of the investigation that were presented by the employer didn't specify which employees were found to have engaged in this behavior. And it also didn't detail the corrective measures that was taken by the employer to discipline these employees for their behavior online. So this case really does highlight how a company's responsibility to investigate social media conduct is important to the extent that it is impacting one of their employees' safety or well-being. So it is a helpful key takeaway from this recent Ontario Labour Relations Board decision. We're going to shift gears a little bit and turn to remote and hybrid work, which is a more recent topic on the mind of employers since the pandemic. So prior to COVID, it was pretty normal that all employees were on site all the time. And we saw an increase in support for working from home since the pandemic, when we realized that we can actually do our jobs from our living rooms and don't need to be in office all the time. The reason Gen Z is a proponent of working from home is likely due to the fact that they were entering the workforce at a time where remote work was at peak popularity, so they grew accustomed to it. They weren't accustomed to in-office culture, and so it's understandable why they tend to be more enthusiastic about remote work, because it's really all they've ever known. But remote work actually isn't just popular amongst Gen Z. People of all age groups find remote work to be helpful in some respects, particularly because it brings benefits of productivity. Now, this isn't really just speculation. A study done by Statistics Canada confirmed that productivity in the public federal sector, where remote work became popular, actually grew by 4.5% between 2019 and 2023. And a survey done by Spark Advocacy also spoke to Canadians who thought that remote work was actually really helpful for employees. about 2/3 said that it was good for organizational productivity. And we're given a choice between the best approach for companies to take in the future going forward, where we are now half in office, half working from home. The majority actually thought that a flexible approach for managers is the best choice for each workplace. So to allow employees to make a decision on whether or not they choose to be on site all the time or opt for a more hybrid environment. And only 15% from the survey actually thought that it was best to have everybody on site as much as possible. And I guess the reason we're touching on this is to sort of debunk the myths that working from home means that you're not working at all. It makes sense because working from home does cut down on a lot of commute time, lunch times, and commuting to and from work. So in that sense, it does increase productivity from employees since this switch has been made. And I will turn it over to Rachel to talk about intergenerational conflicts at work.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, we're moving right along here. So we can't talk about sort of generations and generational differences and preconceptions maybe about, or broad sweeping generalizations about groups of employees without talking about age-based discrimination here or discrimination generally. And of course, as we're talking about generational issues, that potentially touches on the ground of age. So as we know, employers have an obligation to provide a workplace that is free of harassment and discrimination based on age. That's mandated by human rights legislation and occupational health and safety legislation in many provinces. Of course, discriminatory harassment affects employees' self-worth and dignity. It potentially leads to adverse job-related consequences or creates a poisoned work environment. And it also carries with it potential liability for employers, which can be not insignificant. So you might say, well, we're talking about a younger generation. Doesn't age discrimination just apply to older workers to protect older workers, those who are traditionally nearing or at the traditional retirement age? And so I think it's important to emphasize that both young people and older people can experience ageism and age-based discrimination. So while traditionally ageism has been seen as a concept or a discrimination that only older people can face, that's certainly not the case. So for example, if we take a comment made in the context of a hiring or promotion decision, if someone who's involved in a hiring process says something to the effect of, we're looking for a more mature candidate to handle this job. Well, a comment of that nature arguably could reflect an age-based consideration. And it potentially also conflates the concept of age and perceived experience and capability. So thinking about comments that we make that are in that vein, and being mindful of things that we're saying or what we're considering when we're evaluating workers for promotions or for hiring is incredibly important to mitigating potential violations of human rights legislation. Or, of course, if we're seeing repeated comments of that nature, we could potentially verge into a scenario where there is harassment on the basis of age. And so important to sort of think about these issues as we think about how we are going to navigate and approach working with all kinds of generations and the conflicts and the risks that naturally arise in a workplace as a result of that. So we'll talk a little bit more. Shakila will talk us through concepts about unconscious bias. We'll talk about microaggressions, a lot of which plays into sort of these concepts about discrimination, and which often come into play when considering negative views held by other generations with respect to generations that they're not part of. And it's often, it is sometimes the case, and often the case, that persons in management or decision-making positions may be older, and so they may look at younger generations and holding negative views about younger generations may have an impact on those workers looking to establish themselves in their careers and to advance in their careers. In our current job climate, with younger people experiencing higher levels of unemployment, query whether there is then more potential for more age-related claims to crop up on both ends of the spectrum. But as we're talking about younger people in particular, think about how the fact that there are these higher levels of unemployment in younger people, that may result in more cases being seen or more claims being made on the basis of age discrimination. Of course, we can't move on without flagging that age is just one of the protected grounds of discrimination. So a gentle reminder about the importance of understanding the particular grounds that are protected by human rights legislation, and ensuring that we're being mindful of that when engaging with both our employees and also prospective employees. So what types of intergenerational conflicts are observed, and why? Let's talk a little bit about that. So there was a study cited, and I apologize, I don't have the article reference right here, but there's a study that found that 62% of the study respondents believe that generational differences contribute to workplace conflict. And 31% of those respondents personally experienced such intergenerational conflict. So again, what are we seeing, and why? Now, with many generations working together all at the same time, we have baby boomers, we have Gen X, we have millennials, we have Gen Z. It is perhaps inevitable that there will be culture clashes due to the differing values and working styles of different generations. Often what we hear is that older generations might perceive Gen Z as being unmotivated. And what we also hear is that Gen Z often feels unsupported and misunderstood. There are also, again, some negative perceptions of Gen Z workers as being entitled or disloyal. And I go back to sort of what I said earlier, which is, of course, we always have to be mindful, and it's always risky to assume that all persons in a generation carry particular traits, particularly when we're attributing negative traits to a generation. And it's also helpful to think critically about traits or perceptions that we have about different generations. These perceptions might simply reflect different values held by and lived experiences of different generations. And there's no saying that one particular generation's values are better than or superior to another's. And so, conflicts, often intergenerational conflicts, may arise as a result of this conflict clash, these different views that generations hold about other generations. This may raise, and these conflicts may arise from unconscious bias, may create or result in microaggressions, which are subtle and often unintentional. I'll pass it back to Shakila to talk more about microaggressions.
Thanks so much, Rachel. So, just to piggyback off of Rachel's last point about each generation experiencing and having different lived experiences, we can kind of approach the terms of microaggressions and unconscious bias a little bit differently, acknowledging that each generation will have a different background and have different lived experiences. So they may unintentionally carry some of these unconscious biases and internalize them, and it may come out through microaggressions. So, what microaggressions are basically behaviors or communications, either spoken or unspoken, that feed into stereotypes or a prejudice towards certain groups of people. They can be subtle, and it's difficult to define or pinpoint because they're not always overtly discriminatory. So they can be challenging to determine whether a particular behavior or a comment in fact constitutes a microaggression. But the person who experiences it on the other side might feel that it's ageist or sexist or potentially racist. So microaggressions often involve some sort of an implicit bias, which we will get to shortly. And the person who's committed the behavior of a microaggression might not even be aware that they've done something wrong. Again, this might be because they've held this inherent biases as a result of their past lived experiences or just the nature of the way they've been brought up. And so it might be inadvertent, and they might not even realize that they've made another person feel uncomfortable. But at the end of the day, whether or not a microaggression is direct or indirect, it can ultimately make a workplace feel uncomfortable and fuel further fuel an intergenerational conflict. So it's important to remain mindful of this when you're assessing workplace conflict, and try to assess whether a conduct or behavior actually does fall within the realm of a microaggression. Again, acknowledging that it is quite difficult because the comments can be quite subtle, but to remain mindful of that. And in the same vein, we are going to look at a case that sort of highlights a potential intergenerational conflict that could arise at work. So this is a case out of British Columbia, quite recent, from 2019. It's about a plaintiff who was hired as an articling student with the defendant law firm. So prior to joining the law firm, the plaintiff actually had a blog that provided information about people who faced a driving prohibition. And she maintained this blog and updated it. And then she began working for the law firm as an articling student. And for those who don't know, you need to complete your articling term in order to qualify and become a lawyer. So 4 months into her articling term, the defendant law firm came across her blog that she had started and determined that it hindered the law firm's competitive position in the market, and essentially accused the plaintiff of stealing the law firm's marketing material that belonged to the law firm and using it on her blog. On top of that, the law firm also alleged that she was trespassing and stealing other content, and ultimately terminated her for cause 4 months into her articling term, again, which impacted her ability to subsequently become a lawyer. And so the plaintiff filed a wrongful dismissal claim and said that she was wrongfully terminated. The defendant law firm said that she was actually stealing from them and that they had just cause to terminate, but the court ultimately disagreed. And they used this interesting line here that said there was an unusual power imbalance between the employer and the employee that accentuated in this case. They noted that the plaintiff was a young woman who had recently graduated from law school. She didn't have any local contacts in the legal profession, whereas her employer, the defendant, was the head of an established law firm with several legal contacts in the community. And so there was this obvious power imbalance, and would hinder her from seeking subsequent employment following her termination. So this is a clear case where you can see that the plaintiff's use of a blog and her online presence actually impacted her ability for continued employment with the defendant law firm, and then obviously prevented her from completing her articling term with the defendant law firm. And the court's notes here about the power imbalance are quite notable here. So I had previously touched on this point about bias, and I thought it would be helpful to run through the 3 different kinds of biases that we might see in the workforce. So what's important to note about biases is that they come from our own personal and lived experiences. And with different generations, we know that each generation has a different lived experience from the other. They can also come from what we hear from our friends and our family and our social media and what we consume on our phones and the internet. These can also inform our biases. And again, it could also relate to our culture and the way we were brought up. So biases really fall into 3 different buckets here. So we have explicit bias, which is a result of conscious and deliberate thinking. It's something that we taught ourselves, and we acknowledge that we have this bias. It's pretty deliberate and intentional. Then we have implicit bias, which is a result of past experiences or stereotypes that form an opinion in our minds, and they're typically involuntary, and we're not aware that we have them, and they might seep through, for example, like a microaggression. Microaggressions might be a result of our implicit biases. And the last form is unconscious bias. Again, it's not deliberate or intentional, and people don't often realize that they're making an assumption that is an unconscious bias. So, and we usually receive these from again, our friends or family or affinity groups that we associate with. These types of communities might also inform our unconscious biases as well. And it's important to remain mindful of that and sort of empathize that when you're looking at different generations coming together and working together in one workspace, how their different lived experiences might inform one of these 3 different types of biases, and just to remain mindful of that. I will now turn it over to Rachel, who will discuss a case where an elder employee was found that she was being discriminated against at work amongst her younger colleagues. So I'll turn it over to Rachel for that.
Thank you. Yeah, so, we started off talking about how age discrimination can go both in respect of younger workers and older workers. And so, we're not seeing a ton of case law as of yet dealing with age discrimination claims made by younger employees, but we can look still to the principles that are considered in the case law about older workers or age discrimination claims from older individuals, and to sort of inform how we approach intergenerational differences, or how we think about and manage employees in our workplace on the basis of age, and really how we shouldn't. So we have here this case of Felton and Toronto Singles Inc. from 2020. This is on a Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario decision. In this case, the applicant or the claimant was 62 years old and made a claim of age discrimination after she was terminated from her role as a sales consultant. So she claimed that younger sales consultants were given preferential treatment, receiving better leads and working conditions than she had. She alleged that she was often required to babysit the office while younger colleagues took more lucrative leads. And so she raised age discrimination concerns with the HR director of the company and highlighted her frustration and concerns about inequitable treatment. So I'll just pause there and say how easy it would be for this sort of fact scenario to be reversed. If we had a very young sales consultant not receiving the same sort of leads or not receiving preferential treatment or being treated differently on the basis of their age as compared to other maybe older workers. Again, going back to that sort of example that I had given you about a comment about needing someone more mature to handle something, or I often hear, well, we need someone with gray hair on this. So thinking about comments of that nature, or deciding to assign work or give opportunities to those based on their age, rather than looking at sort of objective criteria of how they perform and what their capabilities and experience is. So coming back to this case, in Felton, the applicant was terminated allegedly due to unsatisfactory sales numbers. And she brought this application before the Human Rights Tribunal, and she contended that younger employees with poorer sales results were in fact retained. And she pointed to her termination as being a reprisal following her complaints about age discrimination and allegations of unethical business practices. So in this case, the tribunal ultimately found that the applicant had established a prima facie case of age discrimination and reprisal. And so the employer in this case was ordered to pay an amount on account of lost wages, as well as an amount on account of general damages for essentially violations of the Human Rights Code. So damages for humiliation, hurt feelings, and so forth. And so this really highlights, again, the legal risks that can come out of treating different generations differently on the basis of age, and treating them negatively on the basis of age. So let's talk about some strategies and tools for how we manage generational differences. And some of these ideas here come from a generational consultant named Scott Miller. And I think these are some really wonderful ideas, really productive ideas. So one idea here is to do what was termed reverse mentoring. So having junior or younger and senior or older staff members pair together to teach each other skills that they would like to learn. So to pair them up, to really encourage communication amongst generations, to hopefully help increase retention and break down barriers by having workers learn what they want to learn from one another. Hopefully ultimately that leads to more productive and satisfied workers overall. And it gets different generations talking. Sometimes these generational differences or these perceptions of generational differences arise because generations aren't actually talking to one another. And so to the extent that you can get your workers engaging, getting to know each other, learning the value proposition that each individual brings to the table, and how they can support one another in their career progression and development, those are all going to be good things for your workplace. Similarly, embracing and playing to generational strengths is another opportunity or another tool in your toolkit. So, again, my giant disclaimer about how every individual that is in a generation is in fact an individual and therefore may have different strengths and values. But generally, we could make sort of general we can think about the general strengths of different generations. So, for example, older generations may have greater industry knowledge, whereas younger generations may have fresh new ideas or be more open to taking risks in testing those ideas. So recognizing different strengths and using them to support each other, it could be very helpful in the workplace. Also important to open discussions with mutual respect. So creating a safe space for healthy debate, encouraging employees to speak up and share their ideas is a good opportunity for most employers and in most workplaces, and to help sort of address generational differences. At the same time, providing guidance to employees on insubordination, the bounds of respectful discussion, and deference to management decisions. That's all very important to ensure a successful and productive workplace. So these are some of the sort of general tips that you could think through as you're approaching managing generational differences. And with that, we thought we would open it up, and we've got a lot of questions that have come in. So we thought that we would go through some questions that have come in to make sure that we're talking about what is important to you. So I thought maybe Shakila, if you don't mind taking the first question.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there had been a question that came in asking essentially, how do you achieve the same objectives with different means for the same team that has several generations of employees? That's a lot of different things there, but a great question.
Yeah, certainly. And I think it sort of goes back to what we were initially talking about with how you would want to prevent like quiet quitting. And I think it's building that team mentality amongst the workforce so that all employees are staying engaged, and it increases the loyalty within a workforce and helps people stay engaged. So same objectives is, involving employees in when the company has a win, or where something good has happened for the company. It helps employees build that mentality of contributing to the success because they actually feel like they're a part of it. And how you do that is obviously going to depend on your workforce and the type of work that you do. But it's sort of fostering that team building mentality amongst the workforce so that everyone is sort of gearing towards the same objectives in the workplace.
Perfect. Another question that had come in, I'll take this one. We will go back and forth a bit. Yeah. So there were a few sort of questions on similar theme, which is, how do you instill a giving culture where you don't count work time to the minute, or how do you encourage work ethic? And then of a similar vein, how to handle clock watchers. So maybe this goes to your discussion earlier about quiet quitting, and generally how do we motivate employees at work. And so on this, I think this is where it can be very helpful to look at different generations and the values that they typically have. So, if we know that Gen Z generally really values autonomy, well, how can we try and build that into their role? How can we give them greater autonomy in the workplace? And if we do these things and we sort of hit at their different values, then ideally and hopefully the outcome of that is that they are more motivated. They are invested in their employment and their employer's organization. And so, to the extent that we can do things that play into the values of a particular generation, the goal and the ideal, of course, then is that results in a productive workforce and productive employees. Even those who may historically have been clock watchers, if we really get them to invest, then and if we really motivate them in that way, then perhaps they will no longer be on our list of clock watchers. Okay, Shakila. And maybe this is a little bit in a similar vein, but what are the motivations of the new generation? What are they looking for at work? And what are some concepts to be reviewed when assessing motivation during the selection interview? It's a great question.
No, that is a really good question. So I think a lot of it has to do with what you had initially touched on at the beginning of the presentation, Rachel. I think long gone are the days where employees are looking to stay with one employer and stay there until retirement. I think Gen Z is approaching their workplace and their employer with sort of a critical eye of ensuring that they align with their personal values, and they're not necessarily always going to stay there just for a paycheck. In order to sort of pre-screen this at the interview stage, I think it's important to when you're interviewing a Gen Z is to sort of ask them what their long-term goals are, and that sort of gives you, I think, an insight into whether or not this employee is actually going to stay here for the long term. And through discussions, you can also find out, what their values are and whether or not they align with your company. And you can also sort of get an insight as to what questions they're asking you of your organization. I always found, if they're inquiring a lot about, racial justice and your commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion, or your environmental commitments, you can sort of see if they're inquiring about those, then it's likely something that they care about. And you'll want to keep that in mind should you decide to take them on as an employee. But so definitely, the interview stage is a good place to pre-screen for all of that, and it could also help account for any turnover later on in the line, down the line. So those are, I think, the key takeaways that I would sort of approach this question with.
Perfect.
Is that helpful? Yeah.
That's great. So I created a whole flurry of questions that came in around my comments about recording meetings and social media and the virtual environment that we are working in. So I don't know. I think there might have been 10 different questions on this issue, which is really, is there some sort of statement that an employer can make for virtual meetings, or is there some sort of policy that an employer could put in place that would make sort of secretly recording a meeting, a violation of the employer's policy, and a lot of questions in that respect. So I just want to clear that up. You can certainly make it clear as an employer in your policies, in your code of conduct, for example, that employees aren't permitted to record meetings unless they've sought the agreement of all other meeting participants. You can certainly take that approach. But yeah, certainly it's something that still happens. And so even if you do have that type of policy in place, or you do set those expectations in your workplace, I think sort of our general watch outs about being mindful about virtual meetings and the fact that they can be recorded are still remain. And so we should still be cautious with that. I thought there was another really interesting question that had come in about the impact of the economic climate right now. And so, Shakila, you had talked about promotions and hiring and how that could be impacted. And we were talking about not holding Gen Z in line for promotions, for example. And so there was a question asked about what's recommended in the circumstances to prevent quiet quitting, given that businesses might not be able to promote it at the sort of speeds or rates that are typical. So, I mean, I had some thoughts on that. I'll start, and then if you have other thoughts to jump in on, I think it's an excellent question and a very timely question. So when I look back to things that Gen Z values, I think about how transparency is something that is valued. And so, there are business realities, and sometimes promotions aren't available or hiring might be impacted. Or compensation increases might be impacted. And so sometimes I think, a lot of this just goes back to communication, open, transparent communication with employees about these issues, about the pressures a business might be facing, in order to make employees feel part of the team and part of the sort of overall discussion about what is happening in a workplace. So, my initial instinct is we can think about being open and transparent in our communication. And then, Shakila, you had raised lateral moves, for example. I don't know if you want to talk a bit about that as another strategy.
Yeah, certainly. That's actually what was coming to mind when you initially asked the question. It's not necessarily a promotion, that would help. It's not the only answer to prevent quiet quitting because, as you mentioned, promotions aren't always something that's available to companies and employers. So certainly a lateral move that doesn't result in an increase in compensation, but could be just a different set of duties for the employee to take on that aligns more with their interests and sort of triggers an invested interest in the work that they're doing could be enough to get them in a more supportive and better mindset about the work and the company they're working for. Similarly, asking them if there's any changes in the working conditions that might help them, whether that's the possibility for a hybrid work, if that's possible and works for the company, that might help them, that might prevent the attitude of quiet quitting, and also, having those dialogues and making sure that you're having discussions with the employee, and taking any feedback and taking back any feedback that they might offer you, and trying to implement it to the extent possible, are also ways to sort of combat the quiet quitting trend at work.
Wonderful.
Rachel, just before you move on to the next question, I noticed one about one of the cases we had discussed about the Shannon Horner case. Somebody had asked if, I'm just finding the question now. If it's better for employers to share the outcome of an investigation on which employees were found to have been disciplined and share the level of discipline that they were subject to. And I think this is in reference to the online harassment case where the employer found that a couple of employees had harassed an employee online, and the employee ultimately ended up filing a complaint under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So just to answer that question, yes, it's actually a legislative requirement under Section 32.7 sub 1 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act that where an employee brings an allegation of harassment to you in the workplace, it is one of the requirements that you're not only required to investigate the harassment, but then you're also supposed to inform the employee who brought forward that complaint of who exactly was involved in the harassment, and then also any corrective action that you took as a result of that investigation where harassment was found. So it's a legislative requirement.
Perfect. So I think I'll take one more question here, and then I think we'll probably wrap up. Really excellent discussion in the chat. So thanks to all of our everyone who's attending and participating. There was a question that had come in about the enforceability of employment consequences, or essentially the question came in as to, can you discipline or terminate someone for their statements made on a personal social media account, specifically if this comes to sort of personal opinions, not blatant hate speech. And so I think and of course this raises the issue of off-duty conduct and whether or not an employer is able to discipline or dismiss an employee on the basis of their off-duty conduct online. And I think we have to go back to sort of the general case law and the concepts here about, we can't just terminate or discipline because we don't necessarily like what someone has said on their personal social media account, but rather we need to sort of be able to prove that there is reputational harm for the employer, that this results in, for example, a toxic work environment. We need to sort of go back to those issues and really see if on the facts of that personal social media account and those particular circumstances, whether or not we've really established and proven that that amounts to, or that social media activity amounts to just cause for termination. And off-duty conduct is really hard. We all know that cause just generally in Canada is hard to establish, and then of course off-duty conduct is often sort of a heightened threshold or a higher threshold. So really excellent questions, things definitely to think about. And it's just been a wonderful discussion in the Q&A portion today. So with that, we've come to the end of our time today. Again, thank you to all of our viewers, and thank you to Shakila for joining us today. You will see up on your screen information for CPD credits for Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia, and links have also been added to the audience chat. If you don't get a chance to claim your certificate today, the certificates will be sent next week. We wanted to let you know about our next LEHR webinar, which will be held on June 20th. The topic for that webinar is Navigating Workplace Investigations in an Evolving Environment, Ensuring Fairness and Reviewing Current Developments. And for your reference, a link has been added to the audience chat if you wish to register. So thank you again so much for coming, and we wish you a wonderful afternoon.